The Krath Empire arrived above Earth on a Tuesday, and by Thursday they had given humanity a gift no one had asked for. The peace summit had lasted 11 days. 11 days of craft diplomats seated on floating thrones, of translators who translated slowly on purpose, of maps redrawn to remind humans which arms of the galaxy they were not allowed to travel through. Earth had negotiated from a position everyone understood to be weakness. The Krath had 2,000 ships in the sector. Humanity had 400, most of them barely worth the name. On the final day, Grand Warlord Vizerick of the Krath Ascendancy stood on the observation deck of his own flagship and made his announcement in a tone that sounded to human ears like a father praising a slow child. The Krath, he said, wished to leave the human species a token of the summit, a gesture of magnanimity, a reminder that even the smallest civilizations deserve dignity. And so, above Earth's northern hemisphere in a slow and permanent orbit, he would leave them the crippled hulk of the Krath dreadnought Unbroken Throne. The ship was 4.2 kilometers long. Its spine had been fractured in a border skirmish 9 years earlier. Its power core had been removed. Its weapon batteries had been welded shut from the inside. What remained was a corpse of a warship, a monument, a war trophy so vast that Earth's own space stations looked like satellites orbiting its hull. Vizerick smiled with all 4 rows of his teeth when he made the offer. The human delegation smiled back with only 1 row, which was all they had. The insult was not lost on anyone. In the private channels of the Krath fleet, officers laughed about it for weeks. A dreadnought is the pride of an empire. To leave a broken one in a primitive species sky was not generosity. It was a statue of a boot on their throat. Every child on Earth would grow up looking at the underside of a craft warship and know, without being told, whose sky they were standing under. There was a second layer to the insult which the craft believed the humans had not yet understood. The Unbroken Throne was not entirely empty. Its passive sensor array had been left intact. 6 low-power surveillance nodes buried in decks. The humans would not know to search would quietly report Earth's radio traffic, economic patterns, and military movements back to Krath Command for decades. The ship was a gift, and it was a listening post, and it was a headstone. The Krath were proud of the layering. Earth received the gift with quiet dignity. There were no protests. There were no press conferences full of clenched fists. The Secretary-General of the Terran Coalition, standing at a podium in Geneva, thanked the CRT Ascendancy on behalf of all humanity for the honor of their trust and the beauty of their gesture. She used the word beauty twice. She smiled the way people smile at funerals. In the back of the room, 3 military attaches took notes without looking up. The craft fleet departed the system. 4 days later, they left behind a single automated inspection buoy programmed to make a slow pass of the derelict every 18 months to confirm that the humans had done nothing more ambitious than repaint the outer hull for tourists. The craft expected the ship to become within a generation a museum. They expected school groups. They expected a gift shop. They got the gift shop. It opened in the 7th month in what had once been the Unbroken Throne's forward observation gallery. It sold model kits and freeze-dried ice cream and lapel pins shaped like the ship's silhouette. Human children were photographed under the ruined command bridge in staged poses of awe. The craft surveillance nodes recorded every squeal of delight and forwarded it home, and Kraft. Analysts filed the recordings under confirmed pacified. What the analysts did not see, because it happened in the 12th month, and behind an airlock that had been quietly rebuilt to defeat their sensors, was a small woman in a scuffed pressure suit walking onto the ship's ruined engineering deck for the first time. Her name was Dr. Enzitsa. She was 41 years old. She had spent the past 11 months mapping every millimeter of the unbroken thrones, interior with instruments the Krath did not know humans could build. She had memorized the layout of a warship the size of a mountain. She knew where the surveillance nodes were. She knew which corridors were structural and which were decorative. She knew what the Kraft had removed. And more importantly, she knew what they had assumed humans would never understand well enough to want. She stood on the engineering deck with her team of 83 engineers behind her. The Kraft surveillance node in the ceiling was 3 meters to her left, and it was at this exact moment receiving a looped recording of an empty corridor from the previous week. Arita looked up at the massive empty socket where the ship's power core had been. The first year was arithmetic. Humanity took the unbroken throne apart the way a medical student takes apart a cadaver, not to destroy it, but to learn what a body was supposed to be. Every panel was labeled. Every conduit was traced. Every alloy was sampled, spectrographed, and cross-referenced against every metallurgical database humanity had. The Kraft had built the ship out of 47 substances humans had never seen before. By the end of year 1, they could make 23 of them. By the end of year 2, they could make all 47 and 4 alloys the Kraft did not have. The second year was theft, not from the ship, from its silence. The Kraft had removed the power core, but they had not removed the shape of it. The socket, the mounting struts, the conduit geometry, the shielding runes stamped into the deck, plating around the reactor bay. All of it told a story about what kind of fire had once burned there. Human physicists spent 14 months arguing about the story. In month 15, a graduate student in S. Paulo named Beatrice Okafor drew the correct diagram on a whiteboard and then sat down and cried for 20 minutes because she understood what she had drawn. The unbroken throne became in a way no institution had ever been before a school. Every major university on Earth sent students to serve rotations aboard her. There were dormitories built into the old Marine barracks. There were lecture halls carved out of the gunnery decks. 19,000 engineers rotated through the ship in the first 8 years. They came in as specialists, metallurgists, plasma physicists, quantum cryptographers, xenolinguists, and they left as something new. They left as people who had touched the bones of a warship, built by a species that had considered them vermin, and who had understood those bones better than the species that had grown them. The upper decks were maintained exactly as the craft expected. The gift shop expanded. A restaurant opened on the observation gallery. A permanent exhibition on craft naval history was installed on the promenade, curated with such academic care that craft cultural attaches, when they visited, were reportedly moved. Every 18 months, the craft inspection drone slid through the visible sections of the ship, cataloged the placement of the tourist displays, confirmed that the surveillance nodes were still transmitting their pre-recorded loops, and departed satisfied. The craft drone never went below Deck 34. The humans had made sure the airlocks. Below Deck 34, did not from the outside appear to exist. Below Deck 34, in the sealed and shielded lower hull that the craft had considered structurally sacrificial, humanity had rebuilt a warship. Not a copy, not a restoration, an improvement. The new power core installed in Year 7 was a human design. It drew on the craft geometry the way a cathedral draws on the bones of the mountain it was carved into. The shape was inherited, but the fire was ours. It generated 41% more output than the original. It ran cooler. It could be brought online in under 90 seconds. A figure the Krath, whose warships required 6 hours to spin up from cold, would have refused to believe. The weapons' batteries were unwelded. Then they were rebuilt. Then they were replaced. By Year 9, the original main batteries had been removed entirely, replaced by a class of weapon the craft had no name for because humanity had invented it in a laboratory in Kyoto in Year 6. The shields were the strangest work. The craft shield geometry was elegant, a woven lattice of overlapping hexagonal fields, and human engineers admired it the way one admires a beautiful proof. Then they tore it apart. The new shield was not a lattice. It was a shifting phase modulated envelope that changed its own resonance signature every 1.4 seconds. It could not be locked onto by craft targeting systems, because from the perspective of a craft sensor, it was never quite the same ship twice. By Year 11, the unbroken throne under her hull, under her name, under the tourists sipping coffee on her observation deck, was a warship again. Faster than she had been, stronger, hers. Year 12 began quietly. The gift shop hosted its annual model building contest. A class of school children from Nairobi toured the promenade. Dr. Enz Aritza, now 63, walked the lower decks with her hands behind her back and inspected the last of the weapon calibrations. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for 6 months. On the third Tuesday of Year 12 at 4:17 in the morning Geneva time, 14 Krath warships dropped out of superluminal transit above Earth without announcing themselves. The lead ship broadcast an ultimatum on every human channel simultaneously. The Krath Ascendi had reviewed humanity's 12 years of technological development and found it insufficient. Earth would be incorporated into the ascendancy as a client protectorate. Full submission was required. 60 days were granted for the transition of government. On day 61, refusal would be treated as rebellion, and the craft fleet above would begin orbital bombardment. The 14 warships arranged themselves in a slow crown around the planet. Their commanders opened wine. They counted their own ships. 14. They were satisfied with the number. They had not counted carefully enough. Humanity's public response delivered by the Secretary-General in a broadcast that reached every craft ship in the system was a masterpiece of controlled grief. She spoke of the difficulty of the choice. She spoke of the need for careful consultation with member states. She requested 45 days for internal deliberation before formal terms could be signed. She used the word regret 4 times. She wept once on camera, and the tears were real, though not for the reasons the Krath believed. The Krath granted the 45 days. They granted them contemptuously, the way a jailer grants a condemned man his final meal. Their fleet remained in orbit, weapons on standby, commanders rotating through leisure shifts on their observation decks. Grand Warlord Vizarek watching from his flagship, remarked to his officers that the humans were even more docile than his analysts had predicted. He ordered the invasion timetable revised. Instead of 60 days, incorporation would be completed in 42 in the Deep War Room Complex beneath Cheyenne Mountain. The actual response was being executed at a pace that would have terrified anyone who saw it. Admiral Mahan, 49 years old, 3 combat tours in the Belt Insurgency. A woman whose reputation for calm was so total that her staff called it a medical condition, sat at the head of a table with 16 commanders and 1 civilian engineer. The civilian engineer was Dr. Anna Zaritza. She had aged visibly in the past 2 months. She looked, Chun thought, like a woman waiting for a birth. Every negotiator on the human diplomatic team knew exactly which day to concede which point. Every economic subcommittee knew when to leak plausible panic to the Kraft surveillance nodes. Every carefully staged protest that the Kraft analysts observed and cataloged was a note in a symphony, being conducted from a bunker in Colorado. Meanwhile, at 4:04 in the morning on the 7th day of the negotiation window, the unbroken throne, under her real name, now the name stenciled onto her rebuilt spine in year 10, Terra Prima, activated her power core for the first time under her own command. She did it silently. The Kraft surveillance nodes in her upper decks were still transmitting their pre-recorded loops. The Kraft inspection drone was 3 months out from its next pass. From orbit, the ship remained exactly what the Kraft believed her to be: a museum, a monument, a corpse polished to a shine. But in her lower hull, for the first time in 17 years, a Kraft-built fusion geometry burned with a human fire. Terra Prima's engineers watched the readings on their consoles and did not cheer. Some of them wept quietly. Eritza sat in the command chair. She had insisted on being present for the ignition and rested her forehead on her fingertips and breathed out for a long time. The first live weapon test was conducted on the 22nd day of the negotiation window in a region of the outer solar system where no Kraft sensor could observe. A single main battery discharge was fired at an asteroid 70 meters across at a range of 11 light seconds. The asteroid did not explode. It did not vaporize. It ceased. The energy signature of the discharge, reviewed by human engineers, did not match any of their predictive models. The weapon had performed by every measurable metric 31% better than they had believed possible. The chief weapons engineer, a Norwegian named Stenhillard, sat down on the floor of the observation deck and laughed until his crew grew worried about him. The Kraft fleet above Earth registered the energy spike. Their sensor officers logged it, examined it, and forwarded it up the chain of command with the classification industrial discharge, probable fusion accident, human infrastructure. The Kraft commander who reviewed the log noted that the humans appeared to be having difficulty maintaining their outer system mining stations. On the 40th day of the negotiation window, the Kraft began their landing preparations. Troop transports were queued in low orbit. Cultural liaison drafted the ceremonies of submission. Vizerick on his flagship selected the wine he intended to drink at the signing. On the 44th day, at 2:11 in the morning Geneva time, Admiral Chen entered the command deck of Terra Prima. She was wearing a uniform that had, until that morning, existed only in a locked cabinet. It bore no insignia of any nation. The patch on her shoulder was a single symbol, a broken sword reforged. She sat in the command chair. She looked at her officers. She looked at Enzarita, who was standing at the back of the deck with her arms crossed, because Arita did not sit down at moments like this. Terra Prima did not launch. She rose. Her fusion drives did not roar. They hummed a low tectonic frequency that registered on seismographs across 3 continents and was mistaken for the first 6 seconds for a small earthquake beneath the Atlantic. Her hull, which for 12 years had appeared to be a stationary ornament in the northern sky, detached from her orbital mooring and began to accelerate downward through the mesosphere, then the stratosphere, then the troposphere. And then she stopped. She hung 200 kilometers above. The surface of the earth and the morning sun rose over the curve of the planet and struck. Her rebuilt hull, and the world saw her, and the craft fleet saw her at the same instant. For a full 9 seconds, nothing in the craft fleet moved on the bridge of the Krath flagship Sovereign Ascendant. Commander Tirasuval, a decorated warlord, Anasia Vasarik, a woman who had once served as a junior gunnery officer aboard the Unbroken Throne in her 3rd year of naval service, stared at the tactical display and said a single word her officers had never heard her say before. It was a CR obscenity that carried no direct human translation. Roughly it meant, "The dead have opened their eyes." She knew the ship. She recognized a notch in the forward superrupture, where a debris strike in the Kesseran engagement had punched through and been imperfectly patched. She recognized the ship, and she recognized that the ship had been rebuilt into something she did not recognize, and both truths sat in her chest at the same time. It took the craft fleet 14 seconds to declare a battle station's condition. It took them another 22 seconds to attempt targeting locks on the ship hovering below them. The targeting locks did not acquire. The craft fleet targeting systems were designed to lock onto craft standard shield geometries, the elegant hexagonal lattice they had built into every warship for 2 centuries. Terra Prima shields were not a lattice. They were a shifting phase modulated envelope that changed its resonance signature every 1.4 seconds. From the perspective of a craft sensor, the ship below them was not a ship. It was a probability, a ghost, an outline that refused to hold still long enough to be shot. Commander Vell ordered manual targeting. The gunnery officers switched to visual sights which had not been used in craft combat for over 100 years. They fumbled with controls their training had not required them to touch. 2 of them dropped their aim reticles. Terra Prima fired first. She fired 3. 3 main battery discharges spaced across 4 seconds, targeting the Fleet 2, 7th, and 11th ships, the fleet's electronic warfare vessels. Disabling them would blind the craft command network for approximately 11 minutes. The first shot struck the craft cruiser Voice of the 9th star and turned its third into a slowly expanding cloud of ionized alloy. The ship did not explode. Its engine simply stopped existing. It began to drift, silent, its lights dimming. Its crew unhurt, but suddenly aware that they had been moved to a category of being called survivors. The second and third shots produced identical results. In the 11-minute window that followed, the craft fleet remaining 11 warships attempted to coordinate a response without their electronic warfare backbone. They failed. Their formation broke into 3 separate command clusters, each unable to acquire a lock on the ship below them. But Viserys was not panicking. He was old, and he had fought species that had surprised him before, and he understood that surprise was a resource that ran out. He opened a superluminal channel to the Krath Reserve Fleet, which had been positioned 2 systems over. As a precaution, he had considered paranoid at the time. The reserve fleet was 40 warships. It included 3 dreadnoughts of the same class as the Unbroken Throne and 37 cruisers and destroyers, commanded by an admiral who had never lost an engagement in 41 years of service. The reserve fleet jumped. It arrived above Earth in 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Terra Prima was 1 ship against 51. On the bridge of Terra Prima, Admiral Chun did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She adjusted the angle of the command chair by 3. On the tactical display, the reserve admiral's face appeared. An old craft, scarred, 4 rows of teeth. An expression Chun recognized as the specific Krath configuration of contemptuous pity. He began to speak. Chun let him speak for 3 sentences. Then she raised one hand and he stopped because there was something in her posture that even a Krath admiral of 41 years' service understood. The Krath admiral looked down. He did not have to look far. The tactical display on his own bridge, which he had been ignoring in favor of the human woman on his communication screen, was already showing him what she was telling him to see. His sensor officer, whose voice had climbed 2 octaves in the past 4 seconds, was already telling him. His own eyes, when he turned to the viewport, confirmed it. 22 ships were surfacing. 2 ships were surfacing. They came up out of the Pacific in 3 clusters. They came up out of the Atlantic in 2. They came up out of the Indian Ocean in 1 cluster of 4. 3 more descended from the upper atmosphere where they had been hidden in the ionospheric shear layer. A piece of atmospheric physics the craft had never bothered to weaponize, because it required a shield technology they did not have. The remaining ships rose from launch bunkers carved into the deep bedrock of 6 continents, punching through the crust and geysers of molten stone. They were smaller than Terra Prima. None of them were larger than a Krath cruiser, but they were all built to the same design principles. The phase-modulated shielding that craft targeting systems could not lock. The human improved fusion cores that spun up in under 90 seconds. The new class weapons that had not existed in this galaxy 3 years ago. They were built in Terra Prima's shadow. Every one of them had been assembled in the deep ocean shipyards and subterranean dry docks carved out during the 12 years the Krath had believed humanity was building a gift shop. The Unbroken Throne had not just been rebuilt. She had been used as a template, and then improved on, and then improved on again, and then reproduced. 22 of her daughters were now surfacing under her shadow. The Kraft Reserve Admiral Castro, VOR, whose career was 41 years of victories, looked at his tactical display and made a calculation he had never had to make before. The calculation was, what does one do when the enemy one came to destroy was not the enemy one came to destroy? He did not have the time to finish the calculation because at that exact moment on his own flagship, a very small thing happened that would end the war. In a private quarters on the 3rd deck of VOR's flagship, a Krath officer of middling rank, a signals liaison named Krevik Sol, whose service record was clean and whose loyalty had never been questioned in 19 years of service, received a single burst transmission on a private frequency. The transmission was 6 milliseconds long. It contained one code phrase. Kravik Sol's real name was Daniel Aritza. He was Dr. Enzitsa's younger brother. He was 46 years old. He had undergone 7 surgical procedures over 3 years to alter his facial structure, his vocal cords, his skeletal proportions, and the pattern of his teeth. He had lived among the craft for 9 years. He had risen from orbital cargo clerk to signals liaison aboard the flagship of the craft reserve fleet. He had memorized the technical specifications of every warship in the fleet he served. He had memorized the exact atmospheric, corrected coordinates of the Krath Emperor's private command bunker on the Imperial capital world. He had also, over the past 6 years, quietly identified and cultivated 3 Krath officers, whose personal loyalties to the Ascendancy were, upon careful examination, less absolute than their public conduct suggested. When the transmission arrived, Daniel Aritza entered his authorization code into a secure craft communications terminal and forwarded the contents of his 9-year intelligence portfolio to a receiving array on Earth. Then he stood up, walked to the officers' mess, poured himself a drink, and waited for whatever would happen next to happen next. On Terra Prima, Admiral Chun received confirmation that the transmission had arrived in full. She nodded once. She turned back to the communications display where Kestrel, VOR, was staring at the tactical picture of 22 impossible warships surfacing beneath his fleet. Admiral Va Chun said, "You have been extended a courtesy. The engagement above Earth is not the engagement you should be considering." She had already sent through a diplomatic back channel, opened 17 minutes earlier, a compressed data packet to the Krath Imperial capital. The packet contained the complete technical specifications of every warship in VOR's fleet, cross-referenced with their current weapon and shield status. It also contained the surface and subsurface schematics of the Emperor's private command bunker, including 3 access tunnels the Emperor's own security service did not know existed. Humanity had not needed to win the battle above Earth. Humanity had needed leverage. And the leverage the Krera had never in their long history had used against them was that a species they had treated as vermin had spent 12 years learning not just their ships, but their palaces. VOR gave the order to stand down. His 40 ships lowered their weapons. Above Earth, the 11 remaining ships of the original craft fleet watched their reserve fleet stand down and followed suit. "How long have you been planning this?" the Emperor asked. "Since the day you left us your ship," Chun said. There was a silence on the channel that lasted 11 seconds. The Krath Emperor, a being whose name was ritually unspoken outside his own court, whose face had been seen by fewer than 300 living beings in his 80-year reign, did something that no Krera had done in recorded history. He closed his eyes. He did not open them for 8 of the 11 seconds. When he opened them, the expression on his face was not the expression of a conqueror. It was the expression of a man who had just finished reading a very long book and understood finally what it had been about. "Explain," he said. Chun explained. She explained without triumph and without hurry, because the moment required neither. She explained the 12 years. She explained the school the Unbroken Throne had become, the 19,000 engineers who had passed through her decks, the 47 alloys they had learned to make and the 4 they had invented. She explained the phase-modulated shield geometry and the graduate student in Espalo, who had wept when she understood what she had drawn. She explained the 22 daughter ships and the deep ocean shipyards and the ionospheric, shear layer and the atmospheric physics the craft had never bothered to weaponize. She explained her brother. She did not use his name on the open channel. She said only that a human intelligence operative had been embedded in Craft Command for 9 years, that the operative had provided the technical specifications of every warship in the local craft fleet, and that the operative had provided the coordinates of the Imperial Command bunker, including 3 access tunnels the Imperial Security Service did not know existed. She said this last part slowly so that the Emperor would understand, and so that the officers standing behind the Emperor would also understand. The Emperor did not react to the mention of the tunnels, but 2 of the officers behind him left the room within 30 seconds, and one of them did not return. "You could have destroyed us," the Emperor said. "No," Chun said. "We could have destroyed you today. Tomorrow you would have destroyed us. Your empire is 2,000 ships. We have 23. This is not a conversation about destruction. This is a conversation about arrangements." The negotiation that followed lasted 6 hours and 41 minutes. It was conducted on the craft side by the Emperor himself with no diplomatic intermediary, itself an event of historic significance in craft political culture. On the human side, Admiral Chun and Dr. Inz Aritza, who joined the channel, 1 hour in wearing the same scuffed pressure suit she had worn on the day she first walked onto the engineering deck of the Unbroken Throne. 13 years earlier, the final terms were signed at 11:47 in the morning Geneva time. The Krath Incorporation ultimatum was withdrawn permanently and by imperial decree. Earth was recognized as an independent sovereign polity of the Orion Arm with treaty rights of transit, trade, and self-defense equal to those of the Crera Ascendancy. The Unbroken Throne, now formerly renamed Terra Prima on Krath Imperial records, a small but exact concession the Emperor personally insisted on, would remain in Earth's orbit as the flagship of Earth's newly established defense fleet. The 22 daughter ships would constitute the permanent Earth defense fleet with the right to transit any craft-controlled system under diplomatic protocols. The human intelligence operative aboard the flagship of the Krath Reserve fleet would be extracted within 48 hours unharmed. The Emperor added, without being asked, that the 3 Krath officers Daniel Arida had cultivated would not be reprised against either, because a species that could hide a spy of that quality for 9 years had, in his view, earned the right to a clean withdrawal. There was one final term added by the Emperor in the last minute of the negotiation, without prior discussion. He requested that Grand Warlord Vassar be permitted to remain in his current post. He offered no explanation. Chun agreed immediately. She understood. Vizaric was to be kept alive and in command, so that every day for the rest of his career he would look up at the ship he had left as an insult and see it flying under a flag he had helped create. The Emperor closed the channel. He did not say goodbye. 6 months later, on a clear morning in October, Earth's first deep space fleet departed the solar system. Terra Prima led the formation. Her 22 daughter ships flew in a loose crown around her. Behind them, 4 smaller exploratory vessels carried scientific and diplomatic missions to the 6 nearest inhabited systems. Dr. Enzaritza was not aboard. She had retired 3 weeks earlier. She watched the launch from a station in low Earth orbit, standing next to her brother, who had been extracted from Kraft Space 11 months earlier, and who had spent most of his time since then sitting quietly in gardens. Neither of them spoke as Terra Prima's fusion drives lit, and the fleet began to accelerate outbound. Enz put her hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel, who had not been touched by a member of his own species in 9 years without a purpose, did not move. On Terra Prima's bridge, Admiral Chun watched the outer planet slide past on the tactical display. Her communications officer, a young lieutenant named Afar, beat Tatrick Afer's niece, though Chun had not made the connection until the girl's 2nd week aboard. Asked whether she wanted the launch statement broadcast on standard diplomatic frequencies or on open craft imperial channels. Both Chun said the launch statement had been written the night before. It was 1 sentence long. It had been drafted by Enzita, who had insisted over the objections of 3 separate committees that the launch of humanity's first deep space fleet required exactly 1 sentence and no more. The lieutenant broadcast it. It reached every listening station in the local cluster within 4 hours. It was within a week the most reproduced human sentence in recorded galactic history. "What you leave with us to break us," the message read, "we return to you as the shape of what we have become.